Hello. Oh. Oh. Hello and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Elise Mender and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guest. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu or speaking with a student worker after the program. After the presentation, we will have some time for a few audience members to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and just ask one brief question. If you have difficulty hearing during the program, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers and they will assist you. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone to please silence their cell phones. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Thank you very much. Good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics for tonight's program with our special guest, Major Garrett of CBS News. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I would like to just remind you of an exciting program coming on Sunday, April the 14th at 4 p.m. We will welcome former presidential candidate and CEO of Hewlett-Packard, Carly Fiorina, for the 2019 Dole Lecture. You can find more details in your event program. We would like to thank the Lawrence Public Library for co-sponsoring our three-part book series this semester, including tonight's program. Following tonight's event, we will hold a book sale and signing with our guests in the back of Hanson Hall. Tonight's interview will be conducted by Dole Institute Director Bill Lacey. Our guest tonight was recently named CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent. Prior to that appointment, he served as the network's Chief White House Correspondent from 2012 to 2018, and he spent 16 months on the road covering the 2016 Republican presidential campaign. In total, he has served as a White House correspondent for 3 news outlets during the last 4 administrations. This is Major Garrett's second visit to the Dole Institute. He was part of our 2010 post-election conference. He is the author of several books, including his most recent work, Mr. Trump's Wild Ride, The Thrills, The Chills, Screams, and Occasional Blackouts of an Extraordinary Presidency. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our guest, Major Garrett.
Major, welcome back to the Dole Institute. Delighted to have you here.
Bill, thank you very much. And let me just say I'm deeply honored by all of your presence. I've never had an overflow room in my life. I didn't have one at the University of Missouri where I graduated. I am dressed appropriately. I hope you will judge me properly for that. For the benefit and the honor of an overflow room, I will always hold Lawrence and the Dole Institute deeply in my heart. So thank you.
Major, obviously we're going to talk about your book,
Sure.
but I want our guests to know a little bit more about you personally tonight. So let's start, if you could describe your upbringing, your education,
Sure.
and how you got into journalism.
So I grew up in San Diego, California. Both my parents were executives. They worked for AT&T. So in the 60s and 70s, I had the greatest benefit of any man my age now. My mother worked, carried a briefcase to the office, just like my dad did. And that prepared me for the future. in ways that most of my male counterparts were not prepared for the future. Nothing about the changing world struck me as odd, because I grew up with it. My mother had to fight for equal pay. Back when my mother started the AT&T in the 50s, some of you in the audience may remember this era. Becoming pregnant was a fireable offense. My mother was fired 3 times as a telephone operator. The 3rd time, she had me, and then she went back to work and worked her way up from being a telephone operator to becoming a network engineer, meaning she was in charge of all long-distance telephone calls south of Los Angeles to the edge of the California-Arizona border. That's what she did in the latter years of her life. She never graduated from college, was trained by AT&T. My father also worked for AT&T. He had a different job. He was in marketing. So my mother was the engineer, and my father was marketing a monopoly. Not the hardest job in the world. But the important thing was, both my parents worked, and I listened and spent a lot of time talking to my mother about what it was like to be what she was. Not a hard-charging executive, but someone who had executive responsibilities, who people looked up to, how she mentored other women, how she fought for their rights as well as hers. And it gave me, I think, a valuable perspective on life. I don't have a journalist anywhere in my family. There was no history of journalism in my family at all, or curiosity necessarily about politics. But I was born in 1962, so I grew up in a time of great tumultuousness in our country. I had 2 cousins who fought in Vietnam. Both came home whole. And I remember sending care packages to them, packing them away with my mother. That made me conscious of the external world at a very early age. 68, 69, 70, 71, I don't need to tell any of you, those were news-heavy times in America. My parents, like a lot of middle-class parents, felt that the country was, if not coming apart at the seams, there were signs that things were seriously off the rails, and I was a voracious consumer of all that news that came into our house because my parents subscribed to 2 newspapers, the local San Diego newspaper and the LA Times. Oddly, they subscribed to all 3 news magazines of the time. All 3. Newsweek, Time, and U.S. News and World Report. And I read them all. I was fascinated by the news. We grew up a CBS family. That's kind of a coincidence. I never aspired. I never imagined any time in my life, in my wildest dreams, that I would ever work for CBS, let alone be its chief White House correspondent. So in that sense, it is a fulfillment not only of a dream I had, but a dream I never even imagined I should have. And I decided to go to the University of Missouri School of Journalism on the recommendation of my yearbook advisor, who was an art student there. He said, it's got a pretty good journalism pedigree, you ought to check it out. As soon as I saw what that pedigree was, that was it. Left home, went to school at the University of Missouri, got a school of journalism degree and a political science degree in 4 years. Knew I always wanted to cover politics, but spent the first 6 years of my life in professional journalism, in newspapers, covering cop news. Very basic, granularly factual news. Anyone who's ever been a cop reporter will tell you that work is very specific. And in a community newspaper, if you get something specific wrong about a crime event, you've offended your community. Because there are no small fires, there are no small robberies, there are no small crimes. For the people who are involved in them, it's one of the biggest things, if not the biggest thing that ever happened. And if you can't remember or can't get right whether it happened on a circle or a lane or a court or an avenue, you're disrespecting them. And you're disavowing what you're supposed to be as a journalist. And you're hurting your community in the process. I learned that at a very early age. And it has schooled me throughout my life as a reporter. I try to be as careful, I am as careful as I humanly can be, because facts matter, accuracy matters, and nothing else can be part of my legacy if I do this job right. And if I do it right, it is part of my legacy, and everything else is kind of fodder on the edges.
You've worked, as you mentioned, both CBS. You also worked at Fox as a correspondent. For a correspondent, are there any differences or similarities between the 2 networks?
Well, I worked at CNN, Fox, and CBS.
Oh, okay.
As a White House correspondent for all 3 networks, and did a lot of other things for Fox while I was there. Of course, there are differences, but there weren't any differences for me. There weren't any differences in the way I approached my work. There weren't any differences in the way I was asked to do my work. I was brought into CNN having never been on television as a print reporter. Frank Cisno was the bureau chief at the time, and he kind of went on a binge of bringing print reporters in to CNN. His theory was, I can teach you television, but I can't teach you to be a well-sourced reporter. I have lots of people who are really good at television, but they're not well-sourced, analytical, intelligent reporters who can help me break news. I want print reporters to help me do that. The TV side, I can teach you. So there was a 2.5-year experiment for me at CNN, which went pretty well for me, but when Frank Sesno was fired, a month later I was fired. Sometimes it happens that way in television. Fox picked me up, and I was there for 8 years, and I said it, Roger Ailes said it, I was the least Fox reporter at Fox. It worked well for Roger, it worked well for me. We don't speak ill of each other. It would be hypocritical for me to speak ill of Fox, and it would be there was never any percentage in Fox speaking ill of me. I left the network, went to National Journal. I was noticing in the plaque room there was a couple of National Journal cover stories of Bob Dole. It was a great place for 2 years. Then CBS came along and offered me this chief White House correspondence job. CBS has a different place in the media atmosphere, the universe. For some Republicans, it's regarded as something hostile and untrustworthy. Some of that is still part of the Dan Rather era. I'll tell you a quick story to give you an idea of what the differences are when you change networks, even though you're the same kind of reporter. During the 2016 campaign, I was in St. Louis getting ready to get on a plane, and the woman who took my ticket recognized me and said, "You're Major Garrett, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "You used to work at Fox, right?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." "You're now at CBS." "Yes, ma'am." "How could you be a traitor?" Now that's a heavyweight word. Traitor. And I said, well, ma'am, I just changed jobs and I'm very happy. Can I get on the plane now? So my job doesn't change. My job and my approach to it has never changed. When I was at Fox, I interviewed Barack Obama 6 times. Jake Tapper interviewed him 3 times. I worked for Fox, he worked for ABC, all right? That doesn't mean I'm a better reporter than Jake, but I was certainly aggressive, and there was nothing about the Foxism behind me that prevented or discouraged Barack Obama from talking to me. Same thing with Hillary Clinton. So I've never changed, but the atmospherics and the appraisal of me as I've moved has shifted. I have Twitter followers who, when I was at Fox, were certain that I'd been lobotomized as a child, who, when I went to National Journal and would suddenly pop up on MSNBC, would find this new appraisal of my newfound intellect. Doing the same work I've always done, but the sort of Jerseyfication of American news consumption, meaning people see or interpret a jersey that you have on because you're someplace and not another place, changes the way you're perceived, even though you're the same person across the board.
Mm-hmm. Major, can you tell us why you wrote this book and how it's different from other books that have been published on this administration and this president?
So this book is about what happened, not what didn't happen. That's point one. What I mean by that. There are a lot of things that were in Bob Woodward's book, Fear, that sold magnificently well. It was deeply researched, that things people were afraid of that might happen with President Trump but didn't actually happen. There are a lot of things in Omarosa's book and Fire and Fury, Michael Wolff's book, all of which have sold better than mine, about things that sounded scary but more or less didn't happen. Or there was a tremendous amount of gossipy intrigue, because this White House generates gossipy intrigue at a very high level of propensity. I chose, because I'm a journalist and because I'm an institutionalist, I care about Congress and the White House, to focus on things that actually happen. Things that once the country gets on the other side of its emotional reaction to President Trump, on both sides, positive and negative, can fairly appraise what actually happened, what's likely to be with this country 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 10 years, maybe 15 years from now, that are reflective of the fact that he won and Hillary Clinton didn't win in 2016, and what those circumstances were, what they created, how that creation occurred, and why it possibly matters. The other thing that's distinctive about this book, I think, is that it's all on the record. Everyone in this book is named, and every quote is on the record. Now, that's not because I don't believe in anonymous sources. Clearly I do. I've been in Washington since 1990. I've used my fair share. But these times, it felt to me, required something that was in its own right self-validating. meaning I can't go to every possible book buyer and say, believe me, I wrote it. I wrote it, you read it, you tell me if it's wrong. And you look for the clamoring people who've been misquoted. There's not one. There's not one. So, it's journalistic in a way that I hope is permanent, that is not balanced in the sense that what is balance? It's journalistic in the sense that it faults the president where the facts legitimately fault him, gives him credit for achievements where the facts show that things are different because he was elected and because he chose to make this decision or that, and appraise the first 18 months in a way that I think tries to embrace the central challenge of the Trump era, which is to focus on the important and not necessarily the interesting. Because there are many, many things that are interesting. There are many others that are also important. My industry tends, I think, disproportionately to focus on the interesting.
Okay. How does the Trump administration go about making policy?
Okay. Give me a left hook right there, you know. Okay, so ordinarily that would not be a trap question. That it's a trap question is a fact, and it's not an editorial judgment, okay? Because the central truth of this presidency is it makes policy haphazardly, okay? It doesn't make policy in terms of the traditional way that every previous White House I covered did, which is have an elaborate and layered discussion, internal debate, agency check-in, agency evaluation, agency sign-off, internal secondary White House deliberation, and then a movement up the pyramid toward the president. All right, that's generally speaking how the administrations I covered handled policy. In this administration, it's very much more top-down. The president says he wants to do something. He has an intention. He makes that intention clear. Sometimes people try to make that intention real as rapidly as possible. Sometimes they will shelve that intention to see if the president comes back to it, to see if he remembers it, and then they will gauge just how much a priority it is to him if he comes back to it. This president, unlike other presidents who have been more deeply involved in politics, has a tendency to either spitball or discuss in a kind of free-flowing idea sort of way concepts that are not necessarily familiar with people who are more experienced in politics. He does this on topics ranging from the border to NATO to trade to tax policy, healthcare policy, lots of different things. And there is, at times, for people who work closely with him, something that's endearing about this, that's curious. Some of it's unpredictable. Some of it's a little on the zany side of the equation. But look, he won. He's entitled to ask the questions, he's entitled to get answers, and he's entitled to follow up, which he does. I will tell you, lots of people who are in this book and who helped me try to get my hands around this very question say it's not as chaotic internally as it is described externally, that the president listens more than he talks in private, and that when he does talk, he drives a hard bargain and he asks better than average questions. In times, he asks really good questions and tends to remember the answers that he's fixated about. So something will be said in the White House. 4 weeks later, he'll remember that precise thing that was said and bore in on a cabinet secretary or a senior White House official about that thing they said and what's become of it. So it's different. It is completely different. There is an unpredictability about it. There is a bargaining in public way about it. We're living through it right now. I'm going to shut down the border. Okay, we're living through a bargaining process right now. Friday says I'm going to shut down the border, and I'm not joking. Now it's like, well, if there's not an agreement with Congress, 100% sometime later we're going to shut it down. So what is that? We've never had the kind of public signaling and intense jarring kind of public bargaining from a president. Usually, public utterances of the president are guarded. They are not guarded by Donald Trump. Okay? And I'm not saying that to fault him necessarily. It makes my life at times incredibly exhausting and almost pummeling in the sense of what does this mean and where is this story going and how serious is it? Is this something we really need to pay attention to, or is this whimsical? Is it bargaining? What is it? It makes my life very complicated. But for him, he considers it part of his methodology. And we are seeing it, we are feeling it, we are experiencing it at democracy every single day. And it makes it hard to absorb it all. It makes it hard to contextualize it all. And for those of us who are professionally obligated to try to help you do that, it's a challenge.
Why, what's your assessment of why the president and Republicans could pass a tax cut but not a repeal of the Affordable Health Care Act?
It's a very good question. And it's sort of central to that first year of the Trump presidency. There's one simple answer, which is Republicans are just much more comfortable with tax policy and the idea, ideologically, certainly the last 20 years, of cutting taxes than they are with dealing with health care. More members are more keyed in on that issue. They feel more comfortable talking about it. Either they are intellectually grounded or they're just better rehearsed. But they're more comfortable with the tax dialogue than they are with the health care dialogue. That's kind of an atmospheric thing. Secondly, in the transition, and I recount this in the book on the chapter on health care, during the transition, the president's on a conference call, and he makes a really important policy decision that was not communicated externally at the time, but it had tremendous ramifications. He said, I know you House Republicans and Senate Republicans early in January want to do a straight repeal vote, meaning repeal Obamacare. You want me to sign it, and then we'll get to replace later. The president-elect decided that was bad politics for him. He said, nope, I'm not doing it that way, and I won't accept it. You're going to have to put repeal and replace together. Well, that toppled Paul Ryan, the House Speaker's master plan, if he had one. His master plan was, day one, vote to repeal it, get that vote on the tote board, send it to the Senate for Senate Republicans to take that vote, and then with repeal done, spend some number of months, and I'm right in the book, 6 months, 8 months, 20 months, I could never really find out exactly, from all the key players, exactly how much time they had in mind, but they were going to ride this 6 to 8, 20-month period of unknowingness about how to replace the Affordable Care Act. Perhaps sagely, the president thought that was a loser for him, that he would own repeal and be bedeviled by replace and be hounded by that and the uncertainty of the insurance markets and everyone else. So he said, no, I won't do it. Forcing Republicans, and this is completely reflected in all of his tweets through this process, forcing Republicans to do what they had promised to do long before Donald Trump entered the presidential campaign, which was repeal and replace Obamacare. So essentially, this outsider called the Republican Party's bluff. In fact, it was a bluff, because Republicans had not done any of the legislative work to build consensus and create a product that could pass the House and pass the Senate. On taxes, because health care failed, it became an imperative. A structural imperative. They regarded it as an economic imperative. More importantly, they regarded it as a political imperative. Not just for re-election, but donors were fleeing. The Republican Party infrastructure was suffering under the president's unique approach to the presidency, let us say, the failure of health care and no legislative achievement. So everyone got on board, and the president's own style changed. He was not nearly as involved in the minute legislative negotiations as he was with health care. He let the tax writers do the work, came in and provided support when he could, but was slightly more hands-off than it looked, and that gave Republicans the space they needed to give him the result he most wanted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How has President Trump and his administration changed federal regulation?
Substantially. I devoted an entire chapter to that topic, and I could have easily devoted 2 or 3. It's not a sexy topic. It's not an easy topic to write. Well, you can't write lyrically about it at all. You just have to write in a sort of a plodding way. But no presidency in the modern era, meaning since Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, has reduced federal regulations more rapidly than Donald Trump. One of the reasons is because even though Reagan tried with the same gusto that Donald Trump has tried, Ronald Reagan did not have a compliant, unified Republican Congress. He had a Democratic House and a Republican Senate, and even that Republican Senate was populated by a much higher number of moderate Republicans, moderate to liberal Republicans, Republicans who would not even be in the Senate in the Republican Party now. Lowell Weicker, Charles McMathias of Maryland, just to name two. There were many other examples. Bob Packwood, Mark Hatfield, lots of moderates who were not in sync with Reagan on the deregulatory agenda. Congress now is much more reflective of that Reagan-era politics. And so they're much more willing to go along with this president on the deregulatory agenda, not only through actions that Congress can take to rescind Obama-era regulations, but to essentially let the regulatory agencies slash away without any oversight or curiosity about the motivations behind it, who's benefiting or who's not. And so one of the things that is going to be with this country, with our country, 5, 6, 7, 10 years from now, are the regulatory decisions, meaning no new regulations, almost zero, and a substantial retrenchment, not just of Obama era, but even Bush era and Clinton era regulations. There has been no one who has been more aggressive on that front than President Trump.
And what, in your assessment, has been the result of that?
Well, Republicans will tell you, and business leaders will say, that has created a sense of settledness in the business environment. They're not fearful of anything new, and they are taking advantage and benefiting from things that have been pulled back. So in the business world, it's a very enthusiastic reaction. In some cases, more enthusiastic than the tax cut. Because the regulatory burden, many businesses, small and large, have been telling Republicans for a long time, was out of control and needed a degree of retrenchment. This story, though, is not fully told because we don't know. And I have a sense that at some point, a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, something will happen. A toxin will spill. There will be some safety issue. There will be some number of deaths, and there will be an immediate search to find out what happened, and there will be a pulling back of, well, was there a regulatory regime there? There was. When did it go away? This date. What were we covering back then? Some variety of tweets, something about Mueller, something about something else. The regulatory story has been largely uncovered by the major newspapers, by the major networks, because there's just been so much else. And it's a story that I think will be with the country for a long time, and the ramifications on the front end are probably net beneficial from an economic perspective. I am not convinced they will be long-term.
Okay. If you had to name a couple of successes and a couple of failures that the President and the administration have gone through, what would you name? What are a couple of good examples?
Well, certainly they regard taxes as a success, and structurally it's an enormous difference. And for those who are in favor of it, it's regarded as an achievement. And you don't hear on the personal income tax side many Democrats campaigning for 2020 seeking to rescind the tax cuts for middle-class Americans. In fact, they want to make them permanent. It was structurally incentivized that way. That's the one part of the Trump taxes that are not permanent. The corporate ones are. The estate taxes are, but the middle-class ones have an expiration date, which the Trump White House knew would be a way to incentivize even the skeptics to make them permanent at some point in the future, reviving the tax debate in a politically advantageous way. So from their perspective, that falls into the achievement category. The one thing that I think is undisputable about the Trump presidency is 2 Supreme Court justices and now nearly 50 federal appeals court judges, appointed and confirmed. And I have a whole chapter devoted to this in the book. As a candidate, Trump knew he would have a hard time persuading certain Republican voters that he was worthy of their support. And very early on, March of 2016, he focused in on this idea of the Supreme Court, not just as a talking point, but as a way to create for himself validation with Republican skeptics. And the way he went by that was to create the list. If I'm nominated, if I win, here is the nominees, my list. Look at the list. And he got the list from the Federalist Society, the sort of good housekeeping seal of conservative judicial appointments. That was not an accident. It was an act of political originalism. No nominee of either party had done that. The Supreme Court obviously had been hoisted to an enormous level of importance by Mitch McConnell's decision not to give Merrick Garland even a hearing, President Obama's nominee to replace Antonin Scalia. I explain exactly how that happened, the tick-tock of that in the book, with an exclusive interview with Mitch McConnell on that topic. So all of these things were part and parcel of a 2016 campaign that pretty heavily teased out this question: what's the future of the federal bench? Trump was not coy about that at all. And it was an adhesive bond that kept many otherwise reluctant Republicans on his side and willing to vote for him in the 2016 election. That imprint on the Supreme Court and the federal appeals courts is already there, and it's growing by numbers on the appeals courts. It may grow on numbers on the Supreme Court. I don't know. None of us do. But that is a legacy item already. And I tend to use the word legacy item because it will endure. I leave it to others to put it on the failure or accomplishment side. Clearly, the White House and those who support the president regard it as an accomplishment. He has identified the issue of immigration, but he quite clearly has forged no new ideas about it, and he has lost more than he has won on the question of the wall. The wall made him an attractive potential Republican nominee. It was part and parcel of his win in 2016, not central, but a not insignificant aspect of it. But if you were to think about his immigration policy and what has happened, what he has achieved, not one law has been changed. Many have been denounced, but nothing has been changed. He's forged nothing. He could get no discernible money out of the Republican-led Congress on this. So that has to be regarded as a failure. And the means by which he is now acquiring it is been questioned by 2 votes in the House and Senate. It's now going through a legal process to be challenged in court. Prevail or not, he has jostled the sense of executive authority over a national emergency. All of those things are last gasp sort of improvisational remedies to a failure to achieve anything legislatively durable on immigration, even though it was a hugely important issue for his campaign. There's an enormous gap between the interest and devotion to that issue in campaign and the lack of legislative accomplishment as president.
It may be too early to tell, but give us your assessment of exactly what the Mueller report is going to mean for the Trump administration.
One thing I say in the book is I don't know what so the book came out in September of last year. Unhappily for me, a week after Bob Woodward's book came out. So that was literally like a cork floating behind the Queen Mary or something, you know. Maybe not, it's not even as steady as this, maybe a lot more like this, you know. And I wrote in the book, I didn't know what the bottom line of the Russia investigation was. I say in the book that I had been the recipient of all sorts of fevered phone calls from people supposedly in the know about the next indictment that was going to come down, that was going to break the back of the White House and shatter the Trump presidency, indictments that never came. I wrote this in the summer of 2018, mind you, for a book that came out in September of 2018. And as I wrote that, I thought, well, Major, you could certainly be proven wrong in late 2018 or early 2019. Those indictments may come, and you may look like a fool. Well, they didn't. And when I mean big indictments like Jared or Ivanka or someone who was central to the last 3 months of the campaign, that was integral to that component of it, and the indictments were about that action. Remember, the Manafort indictments were not about campaign activities. The Manafort indictments and convictions were about previous activities and tax fraud and financial malfeasance, not central to the campaign. So those indictments never came. And we have a 4-page summary. We don't have the full report, but we do have one particular sentence that stands out. No evidence, despite efforts to work in a conspiratorial or collaborative way, Trump campaign and Russia. Okay. Is that definitive? Certainly is for the president. It may be for a sizable number of the American public. We'll see the full report, or as much of it can be released. But we have a 2-year period of time where there was this sense something big was yet coming. And the president said it's not. And I would just say, as a general matter, the greatest thing that you can be able to say in politics is, I told you so. Or a Reagan variation of that, there they go again. Well, the president can say both. I told you so, and there they go again. And he's already saying both in his own particular way. That is a position of political leverage. How long it will last, I have no clue. I know I spent a lot of time internally at my network urging caution and saying, look, a lot of our colleagues and a lot of our competitors are living in the vaporous world of speculation on this story. It's a dangerous place. Big stories have a magnetic pull, especially in the social media era and being on television all the time, to pull you into the atmosphere of speculation, because that's how you can keep talking about something. And lots of reporters, especially younger ones now, don't feel comfortable saying what I'm very comfortable saying. I don't know. I don't know. My wife would ask me, where's this going? I don't know. How can you not know? You're involved in everything. I don't know. Quick story. When I was a cop reporter in Amarillo, my very first job, I got a call from a prominent attorney in town, said, hey, Major, I got a great story for you. There was this really bad act of police misconduct, and we're going to sue the city. So you should write about that. So I dutifully write all this stuff down, get all the dates, check stuff, go to the morgue, look at all the articles, run up to my city editor, and I said, we got to write this story. He goes, what's it about? And I tell him. He said, has the lawsuit been filed yet? I said, no. He said, we'll write it when they file the story, when they file the lawsuit. Meaning, we're not going to be used to accuse somebody of something until they've got the courage of their convictions or their facts or the law to sue the city. He wasn't being a stooge for the city. He was teaching me, he didn't even realize it, a really important lesson. Sometimes you have to wait, especially on big stories involving the law. Wait for it to happen. Then report what's happened. Don't imagine what has happened, and don't take one happening here, and this happened a lot in this story. This happened over here. It must therefore mean this is going to happen over here. No. No. That's an extrapolation based on a supposition, based on a theory. Not one of those words have a goddamn thing to do with journalism.
We were talking in my office a little bit earlier, Major, about, I think you said your first presidential campaign you covered was 92.
92, yeah.
And obviously, things are going to be a lot different in 2020 from 92.
Yep.
I wonder if you could give us, and I know it's early, but just give us your assessment, kind of handicap the 2020 campaign, understanding that it's very, very premature.
Well, look, I was never heavily involved in the predictive nature of presidential campaign coverage. I'm a day-to-day reporter. I was rarely favored with the either privilege or obligation to punditize about American politics. So I sort of stick with the Jack Webb approach. You know, what are the facts? What are they right in front of me? And I just go to the story day to day to day. I didn't predict that Trump would win, although I write in the book that I told our political director, Anthony Salvanto, 2 weeks before he could win, and no one at the network should be surprised on election night if he does win. That's as far as I was able to go. And that was just based on going to more than 75 Trump rallies during the 2016 campaign and seeing lots of people and talking to a lot of folks and getting a very deep sense that not only was Trump fascinating and had all this sort of a different aura about him that many supporters found attractive, but separate from that, there was an aspect of the 2016 campaign akin to primal scream therapy for some Trump supporters. They just wanted to scream at the system. And they wanted someone who was as frequently screaming at the system in the volume and the toxicity that they wanted to scream at the system to do so on their behalf. So I didn't have a prediction. I had a low-level hunch. And I was, like so many others, disabled by what I had come to learn from every presidential campaign since 1992, that not the science, but the methodology of contacting voters, running all sorts of data streams, had reached a level of sophistication and precision that it was moving beyond probabilities to almost a precision-based assessment of what was likely to happen based on all these streams of data. Not just polling data, but residential data, demographic data, magazines, sporting events, music. All these things are now part of a large universe of data that can be overlaid and algorithmically analyzed. And with increasing levels of precision, 2004, 2008, 2012, 2016, both parties were doing this work. Maybe it strikes some of you as a dark art, some of it might strike you as a high science. Whatever it is, whatever you call it, it exists, and it is. And I think a lot of us were disabled by these data streams. Like what are the not just their predictive value, but like their precise predictive value. And so you had data streams, and then you had massive crowds. And you're like, well, George Herbert Walker Bush had massive crowds on the tail end of the 92 campaign. He got clobbered. And anyone who's covered a presidential campaign knows you can't get addicted to crowd sizes because they're self-selected partisans who show up because they want to be there. But they're not representative of this necessarily of this larger construct. So that, I think, held a lot, it certainly held me back, and I think it forced a lot of people to make decisions that, and predictions that didn't hold up. So I'm very cautious about 2020. Just a couple of things I will say about 2020 that I think are structurally important. One, the president said last week it's going to be so much easier this time around because I'm already president. And I promised things back then, and I've delivered so many of them now. That's not an illogical argument, okay? One thing that I think he overlooks, possibly to his detriment, is he will not be running against Hillary Clinton. And I'm telling you, that's a very significant part of this equation. He wants to run against Hillary Clinton. He spent the first 2 years, whenever he was in a kind of a squeeze, to talk about Hillary Clinton, because that's a base mobilizer and a reminder of who he vanquished. But whoever the Democratic nominee is, isn't going to be Hillary Clinton, number one, in persona, in history, in whatever it was that people found disagreeable. So he's not going to have that foil. He also is not going to have the structural sense of, that can't happen. And there was some amount, I don't know what the percentage is, nobody knows, of, that can't happen, among voters who, if they thought it was going to happen, would have showed up for Hillary Clinton. That's not going to exist. Everyone knows it can happen now. We had a midterm election, and whatever you think of the result, it was a shattering expression of Democratic participation for a midterm election. Way, way higher vote participation, highest we've seen since 1966. People on both sides were deeply engaged, motivated. They showed up. Nobody's contested that. Nobody's screamed fraud. The system was maxed out at a midterm level. Voting booths, systems, calendars, everything. Huge turnout, much larger than anyone anticipated. People are engaged, both sides. And that level of engagement on the Democratic side is a structural difference from the engagement that was simply not there. In Wayne County in Michigan, which is where the main city in Wayne is Detroit, 80,000 people who voted in 2012 didn't vote in 2016. Now, they were not disproportionately Republicans who sat out that election. Those were Democrats who didn't show up. 80,000 in one county just didn't show up. Well, when you don't show up, guess what happens? You are advantaging those who do show up and the candidate for whom they show up. So those are two structural differences. On the plus side for the president, he's going to have a lot of money. I think Republican donors, I have been told, are a little freaked out about the Green New Deal. They're freaked out about Medicare for all. They're freaked out about expansions of Obamacare, if not Medicare for all. They're freaked out by socialism. That's why the president pounds it so hard. And that freak out factor will deliver checks and may deliver a reservoir of support that's more predictive and predictable, rather, not predictive, but predictable than it was in 2016 when some Republican at the donor level and the other level were like, I'm not so sure. I will now fall back on one of the great cliches of American presidential political punditry. Well, what's going to happen in the suburbs? Well, the suburbs in 2018 were very bad for Republicans. Suburban Republicans were like, no. Even though the economy is good and we like some of this agenda, we are uncomfortable. We are structurally, institutionally, psychically uncomfortable with this, and we're not going to back it up. A lot of them voted yes in 2016. That's another structural question that has to be answered. Now, I was over at the Trump re-election headquarters last week. They have all this massive data and digital connectivity and their rally crowds they are engaging with while they're in lines, afterwards. So they're going to have a full throttle voter connectivity system that they didn't have in 2016. That's a structural benefit. I'm not offering predictions. I'm just showing you what I see so far structurally as big parts of this 2020 campaign. As to who the Democratic nominee will be, I have not one clue at all. I mean, the field will be almost 20. And they're going to have lotteries for the debates. I mean, I hope they do it like the NBA draft, man. I hope they have like the balls coming out and Pete Buttigieg, all right, you get number 1, you know. Beto O'Rourke, 19, sorry, see you next week, you know, whatever. All I can say is competitive, engaged nomination battles generally create an engaged, energized party. Something also to keep in mind structurally.
Okay, I have one last question, then we'll open it up to your Q&As. But Major, we have a number of young people here tonight. Give them some advice on what to do if they're thinking about careers in journalism.
Well, first of all, thank you for thinking of that career. I'm not kidding. I was in Max Usler's journalism class earlier today. Fantastic group of kids. Really great students, asked tremendous questions. I did that not only because Max is here and he asked me, but Max was my teacher at the University of Missouri many years ago. So it was just great to reconnect with him. And I told them, in part, what I'll answer your question. That you're interested gives me tremendous hope and energizes me. Because when I was thinking about becoming a journalist and going to school to become a journalist, the only economic issue I had to worry about was if there was a national recession, because that would tighten the job market. I did not have to ponder existential questions about, will print exist? Will my local newspaper exist? Will my local television station exist? Why is the president calling journalism or journalists the enemy of the people? Why is all there this contestation about what journalism is? How can there be a business future for it in a digital space where consumers have been taught that this can all be produced either for free or nearly free? Because it can't. Journalism is expensive. And the models upon which we collect money on behalf of that journalism are scarce. That's why journalism jobs are comparatively scarce. I cited a statistic at Max's class today. In Denver, Colorado, a great city, 7 years ago, there were two competing newspapers, the Rocky Mountain Daily News and the Denver Post. At that time, they combined employed 600 journalists on a full-time basis. One newspaper has collapsed, and the remaining newspaper has a staff of 80. 80. My dear friend, Mark Russell, who was my roommate my senior year at University of Missouri, he's the first African-American executive editor of the Memphis Commercial Appeal newspaper, and that newspaper's nearly 200-year history. Before he took that job, he was the editor of the Orlando Sentinel. In the 5 years he was editor of the Orlando Sentinel, which was before the Great Recession, he laid off 45% of his staff. 45% of his staff. That's virtually all he did. And I will always credit him because he never did that impersonally. Every person he laid off in person. Looked them in the eye, told them I have no choice, but I got to let you go. It didn't make it any easier, but it spoke to the bravery he has about dealing with people who he had to lay off. That's an industry thing. So any young journalist in college who thinks this is the career for me, God love you, because there are so many ways that the world is telling you, probably not. And you're fighting through it anyway. And they're going to be the ones who are going to help us find this new future of business models or philanthropic models that create local journalism, sustain local journalism, so local journalists can do what? Tell the truth and grow up to become national journalists, like I did. I started in Amarillo, Texas. Then I went to Las Vegas. Then I went to Houston. The low minor leagues, if you will. AAA, AA, single A, double A, AAA ball. Then I got to the big leagues, okay? You can't get to the big leagues at 22. You just can't. Lots of young journalists in Washington now are trying. They don't have the institutional knowledge. One of the things that happens as you get a little bit older is you develop an institutional knowledge, and things have, because of that institutional knowledge, more context, more nuance, and you're more capable of explaining that to an audience who's trying to catch up with you. If you're both catching up in real time, it's difficult. So my advice to young journalists is adapt to every technology that's in front of you. Every single thing. Learn how to do every skill you can think of applicable to a journalistic platform. Shoot video, edit video, understand audio technology. What does a radio soundbite sound like? How does that sound different than a television soundbite? How can you do long-form written journalism and pair it with audio and video? How can you tell stories factually, accurately, curiously across many different platforms? Because that will make you employable. Because everything is converging. Newspapers look like TV stations look like newspapers. The New York Times, you go to the website, the Washington Post. I wish the Kansas City Star and St. Louis Post-Dispatch were there, but they're not because they don't have the financial wherewithal beneath them. But news organizations that do present a wide array of all of these things. Podcasting, videocast, all sorts of ways to capture news, convey information, and make it in an archived way that is permanently useful to the community you serve. And then, I don't have advice for young journalists in this sense, but all of us need to have a collective conversation about the civic value of a local newspaper. I think the civic value of a newspaper is like the civic value that used to be associated with a park or a stadium, a gathering place, a place where a community came to look at itself, to reflect on itself, and to learn about itself. And if I have one criticism of the extravagant wealth achieved in my home state of California, concentrated primarily in two places, Hollywood and Silicon Valley, is that there is nobody there who is willing to plop down a comparatively small amount of money to philanthropically build foundations that support local journalism and back away. Look, we are living through an era of economic transformation not unlike the Gilded Age. And during the Gilded Age, there were barons who aggregated and accumulated massive amounts of wealth, never before seen in America. And either for altruistic reasons or politically cynical reasons or ways just to get them out of uncomfortable conversations, they philanthropically created large institutions, colleges, libraries, art galleries, and the like. There has got to be some way in which we can shake out of the massive reservoirs of wealth, the comparative pittance it would take to put $20 million beneath the Kansas City Star, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, as endowments that slough off money, that hire journalists, that make community newspapering relevant and economically sustainable, and revitalize conversations in local communities. So not every conversation about local politics is red and blue at the national level, because that's what happens when you lose a local newspaper. Everything gets atomized into a national red or blue conversation. And having covered these issues when I was a young reporter, there's not very much red or blue about easements or aqueducts or traffic lights or trash pickup or school boards. Sometimes there are some touchy political, ideological issues for school boards, I grant you that. But when you lose the ability of a community to talk about that, by having reporters just there covering what's happened and render it for the public so there can be a larger, broader debate, you lose something vital. That was kind of a sermon. I apologize.
No, quite all right. Okay, we have two. Do we have two mics tonight, guys? Two? Alex, right here, and Alec, back in the back. If you have a question, raise your hand and get their attention. Don't try to grab me, because they're going to pick you out. They're going to find you. Please ask just one question. Make it brief. I want to get to as many questions from our audience as I possibly can. I've got, just hold this one right here. We'll do it next, right back here.
Well, appreciate you being here. I got a question kind of about what you were talking about journalism school now. I'm a fan of old school, David Brinkley, Charles Kuralt, and all these guys that I've read books about, and I can't stop turning the pages. A friend of mine was at MU when you were actually in the J School, and the thing he told me that he did more than anything else was that he wrote.
Yeah.
And he wrote. And the next class he had to take, he had to write. And he had to write. I'm just wondering, in this day and age of, Facebook and all this other stuff, if they're kind of maybe moving away from that, more of it is talking than writing, because so many of these people wrote so well, and I'm looking forward to reading your book, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm actually not discouraged about writing or writerliness in journalism, because the digital space allows for a much lower cost per word the creation of written journalism. The barriers to entry now are infinitesimally lower than they used to be. You don't need a printing press, okay? You can literally self-publish books at a fraction of the cost that you self-published 20 years ago. And if you want to opine about something, when this is 15 years ago, bloggers just cropped up everywhere. So over the weekend, you might have heard about it, there was a woman who ran for lieutenant governor in Nevada, Lucy Flores, talked about Joe Biden. Where did she talk about that on? Something called The Cut, which is a digital subsection of New York Magazine. Okay, it's just a digital subsection of a printed magazine, created only in the digital space. The barriers of entry economically are super low. People write all the time. All sorts of things crop up, Medium, and all sorts of places. I've even discovered where people write and write and write. Print is not dead in any stretch of the imagination. Print is moving, print is reforming itself, and print is looking desperately for an economic model beneath it. But it's not dying. It's as vivid as it's ever been. There's tremendous writing all over the place because, unlike when I was a newspaper reporter and my A1 story, because another A1 story broke at 8 p.m., becomes buried inside, and I go from 24 column inches to 12. Why? Because that's all the space that's available. What happened to those 12 inches of reporting? They literally died. The only one person knew about him, me. And they were on the cutting room floor, right? Because that's all the space, because we had to get the auto ad in there, or the grocery store ad, or whatever. There is this, the internet, the digital space is much larger, creates much more room. So I'm not afraid of writing going away. I'm afraid of people being less either devoted to writing, and I'm also afraid of the fact that within newspapers and magazines there are fewer editors. There are fewer book editors than there used to be. Thankfully, I had a great editor and a great copy editor. The editor for my book is a guy named Adam Bellow. You might have heard of his father, Saul Bellow. Okay? He's a great editor, a taskmaster, and he's a rarity in the publishing industry now. So I don't worry about print. I don't worry about people writing. I know in newspapers, copy editors have been shrunk to almost non-existence. That's why you see a lot more grammatical errors, a lot more typos in newspaper or digital copy. It's a minefield. And that undercuts the value of our beautiful, exquisite language. Because when rendered well, it is both things. And I wish there were more people who were part of the collaborative process helping writers bring out the best of themselves. But I'm not afraid about the death of print at all.
Okay, next question is right here.
Mr. Garrett,
Yeah.
you may or may not want to comment on speculation that is drifting around about 2020, something that hasn't happened, may not happen, in which Donald Trump will lose the election, and along with Chris Kobach, they will declare voter fraud and refuse to step down, and maybe even more armed militias might be coming forward to keep him in office.
Well, I mean, that's a theory. And I would say there's a couple things about that you might want to consider. One, he didn't raise a peep of objection, fraud or otherwise, in the midterm election, though that dealt him a substantial legislative defeat. Now, he may have internalized it. That's not me. That's Republicans. I don't like them anyway. So it's not about me. I did my best, so it's not personally. So he might have a different personal reaction in 2020. That would be a part of the conversation, even from you at a place like this, tells me people are thinking about that. People will have some sense of that. It will probably be asked and answered in various venues between now and then. That will have its own deterrent effect, I presume. I think one of the dangerous things about looking at President Trump is to take the things he does and assume he always means the worst. And he invites that often. Sometimes for effect, sometimes not. And it's a tough thing. He makes it difficult. He makes discernment difficult about him. He really does. I've told lots of reporters, Trump's mania, which it is, it's a mania, he has an energy, a sort of a force field around him that loves the fight, loves to fight sometimes just for the sake of fighting. That mania can create a mania in you if you're not careful. If you don't guard yourself against it and just try to live in a place of discernment. He does not invite discernment. He invites the opposite of that. He invites powerful reactions and overreactions. It is one of his political weapons. Overreactions. And that's just an observation. I'm not telling you what to do about it. I'm not telling you I have even a theory about what to do about it. I just watch this as a phenomenon. So he invites questions like that. I write in the book that there was some period of time between the Associated Press calling the election for President-elect Trump and Hillary Clinton calling him. And it was a little bit longer than the Trump people expected because there had been an agreement forged at the highest levels of both campaigns before Election Day that after the AP called it, which is regarded by both presidential campaigns and all presidential campaigns as the ultimate arbiter, in no less than 15 minutes, the loser would call it to concede. That was an agreement forged because the Clinton campaign was made understandably nervous by utterances from Donald Trump during the debate that he might not take the election result if he lost. okay? So the Hillary Clinton campaign came with that, forged that agreement at the highest levels of the Trump campaign, so you guys are going to have to call us in 15 minutes. You agree to that, right? And they did. Well, it was more than 15 minutes for Hillary Clinton to call Trump, which irked him because he'd made this agreement, even though it was forged with the underlying fear or anxiety that he might not accept the election results. So your question's not without foundation. At some level, wondering. I would also make this observation. If you go back and read the history books of the day that Richard Nixon resigned, his defense secretary, James Schlesinger, sent out a memo basically saying, do not carry out any order from the president. Because he wasn't exactly sure at that address that night what Nixon was going to say. I'm resigning, or I'm calling in the tanks to guard the White House. The institutional heft of everything, the moment, the country, everything, directed Nixon to do what he ultimately did. But even his defense secretary wasn't certain what he was going to do. I only bring that story up to say we have great institutional history in our country, strength, and thankfully durability. And it is my general sense, perhaps I'm an optimist, that those things will matter a great deal, not just to this president, but everyone that succeeds.
Okay, we have a question back here.
I've seen a lot of reports of media bias. I've seen data that around 90% of reporters lean left and are anti-Trump, and around 90% of the coverage has been against Trump. Do you think there's a substantial media bias, and does it affect the reporting?
So, the 90% negative on Trump, a lot of that was driven by the Mueller story and everything built around that, which was a story of significance in the question. We've never had a question like that asked before in American history. Did the winner of a presidential campaign in any way, directly or indirectly, cooperate with a hostile foreign power to win? That's a big question. Legitimate, it's a big question. So curiosity about the question. You've already heard me describe my thoughts about some of the ways it was overanalyzed and hyperventilated about, but the question itself was not illegitimate, and stories about the question had a legitimacy themselves. Did that overtake other aspects of the administration? Sure. Did Trump have a tendency to step on his own message and create other controversies even when people around him were wanting him to focus on successes? Yes. I give you a couple of examples of that in the book. So did a certain way he invite either controversial or negative coverage? He certainly did. Does that mean certain things about the administration were less either appreciated or covered than others? They were. Is that a result of bias? I've worked for lots of different news organizations, many of which were regarded as biased. CNN, Fox, CBS. I'm probably the only reporter you'll ever meet who's written a cover story for Mother Jones and the Weekly Standard. So I've lived, okay? My joke about that is there was one common denominator between writing a cover story for Mother Jones and for the Weekly Standard. The common denominator was the checks both cleared. You may think I'm avoiding this question of bias. Are most reporters center-left or left in their ideological interpretation? Most I've met are. It's just fact. Does that make them bad reporters? In my experience, no. My biggest problem that I've seen institutionally in journalism has to do with an L word, but it's not liberal. It's lazy. Intellectually lazy, incurious about a rigorous examination of both sides of an issue. And that tends to sometimes vector off who's in power. Okay, so you're suddenly more curious about those who look like they're going to get into power or have secured power, and therefore disproportionately incurious about the other side, and it sort of sways back and forth. Look, a lot of journalistic ethicists don't fault the coverage leading up to the Iraq War as being too liberal by all those liberal reporters and biased neo-Democrats. They fault it for laziness. They fault it for a herd mentality. They fault it for a lack of curiosity about which the government was explaining and whether or not that had any actual relevance, or was it being compared with other oppositional or institutional skepticism. So, was the press corps, by that 90% Democrat or left-leaning, there and suddenly hypnotized by the Bush White House? I don't think so. I think they were lazy. I myself was lazy on that story. I was covering Congress at the time. I was far more fixated on the vote and how the vote would come out, because that was what the story was. Battling for votes and what the vote would be, not what was the underlying debate and what was either being debated or not being debated. I fault myself in retrospect when I was a congressional reporter doing that story. I was not as aggressive and curious as I should have been. So my problem institutionally has nothing to do with liberalism in media coverage. It has to do with laziness and a sense that stories can take a narrative and become a kind of perpetuating narrative. And puncturing or pressing or moving against that narrative is a challenge. You have to be courageous. You have to upset your audience sometimes when you do that. You have to take a few risks. And I wish we would do that more.
Okay, we have a question right here. Then we're going to take one or two more.
Speak briefly about the impact of President Trump on international relations with other countries.
Mm-hmm. So, there are two big headlines about that. One is, and I've been all over the world with President Trump, covered lots of different summits. What does he mean by America first? What is that? What does that mean? Does that mean retreating from international either obligations or institutions? In some cases, yes. Our White House makes an argument today. He's actually strengthened NATO by sort of money-shaming NATO member nations into spending more on collective defense. So you can look at that two different ways. I know European diplomats are unsettled by his approach to America first and feel it's a retrenchment and a retreat from the post-World War II order. I know in Korea and Japan, there is a sense that his initial approach to North Korea and that question, while bombastic, was unpredictable, and by its own unpredictability, created a new atmosphere, and they were receptive to it in ways that surprised a lot of American journalists, because they had seen previous administrations tiptoeing around these central questions. Trump did not tiptoe around them. I don't think that's an exaggeration. And by so doing, changed the conversational atmosphere. Now, interestingly, the president is now finding himself back where a lot of his predecessors landed, which is engagement creates frustration because their motives are not the same as ours, and our options are as limited as they've ever been. So on the rhetorical side, he created a different atmosphere. He created summitry, assuming summitry would have its own magnetic pull to Kim Jong-un and change his calculus. It hasn't yet. It may in the future. We don't know. I write in the book that that's one of the most important big foreign policy stories of the first 18 months of the Trump presidency. The other massive effective is on trade. And I don't think, back to this sort of question about appraising the presidency, if I had a chapter in trade in this book, it would have been about the unresolved debate in 2017, because they were all fighting with each other over tariffs. Finally, in 2018, middle of the year, the president said, damn it, we're doing tariffs, no holds barred. That has changed structurally interpretations of America's economic throw weight and its tolerance for, again, this post-World War II notion that the American economic powerhouse is as much devoted to sort of international development and globalism as it is to its own self-interest. The president's like, nope, American self-interest is first. Globalism may take its own course, international institutions may take their own course, but the first check mark is America. Pure and simple. And if I need to throw tariffs at Canada or Mexico or France or Germany, I'm going to do it. If I'm going to call the Chinese out, I'm going to do what Democrats have always said but never had the guts to do. I'm going to throw tariffs at them and see what happens. I'm testing this question. That is very bold. It is very innovative, and it's new. We haven't really done this with trade policy since the 19th century. I'm not saying it's a good or bad idea. It's a big change, though. It's massive. It has enormous global implications, and we're living with them now. In the Midwest, there's a great sense of uncertainty. Where is this all heading? How many seasons are we going to live in planting seasons with this uncertainty? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But I know he's calling the question in a way it's never been called before, at least in the modern history. He's also interested in ending wars. He's going to get out of Afghanistan. I don't know what the deal's going to be, but we're not talking to the Afghans. We're talking to the Taliban. President Trump is talking to the Taliban and not checking with the Afghans about what's acceptable or not. I guarantee you we're going to be out of there before the 2020 election is held. And he'll have defeated ISIS, at least as a territorial entity, and he won't be involved in any other wars. And he'll say, that's what I'm about. That's also a difference. It's a hesitancy to use American power, but it's not a hesitancy to build American power. He's all for building it and using it as a deterrent, but not engaging and pulling back from where we are engaged. Those are three enormous structural differences. And they're not necessarily Republican or Democrat. They're Trump.
Okay, we're going to take one more question. Sorry, everyone, I've run out of time. I'm going to take one more question, but I want to remind everybody we're going to do a book signing immediately after the program ends. I'm going to ask you to please assist me in getting Major to the front. So please, if you want to say something to him, buy a book and get in line. Or at least just get in line and say something to him then. But do help me get him up to the front so we can get him signing books as quickly as possible. And I'm sorry, this is our last question in the back.
Okay, the press over the last several years seems to have taken a kind of a beating within certain elements of the population where they're just not believed, or as President Trump would say, fake news. Whether that's true or not true, the perception of it is. So how do you think the media itself rebuilds that trust that, at least in some circles, has been lost?
Yeah, so the simple answer to that question is one story at a time, one journalist at a time. I get this question a lot, and I have not a pat answer, but kind of a fail-safe answer. It begins always with this. I'm one reporter. I have a whole career that you can evaluate, and I live by the reputation that I've built through that entire career. I own everything I've done. I am fiercely accountable for everything I've written, everything I've said. It's on me. I never blame any mistakes on my producers. They're mine. Everything is mine, and I have a sense of ownership about that. I encourage that in all my colleagues. Some approach that with differing levels of intensity. So I can't speak for the media writ large. One thing I will say to pick up on your point. Long before Donald Trump got in the presidential campaign, if you look back at the Gallup data on this question of credibility of the mainstream media, that's the major American newspapers, the major networks, NPR and the like. From the mid-90s until like 2014, so again, this is all pre-Trump. Trump has nothing to do with what I'm about to talk about. From Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, credibility scores, as surveyed by Gallup over a long period of time and with lots of respondents, went steadily downward. From 60s for Democrats, 50s for Independents, high 40s for Republicans, down to low 30s for Democrats, mid-20s for Independents, mid-teens for Republicans. I'm frequently introduced at events like this, and oftentimes I will say, that was a very kind introduction, but really I should be introduced as follows. Major Garrett is a somewhat well-known member of an industry with record low market share and declining credibility. I don't think those are, I think those are reinforcing. They are not coincidences. They are not unrelated, okay? I don't know how if there needs to be a solution to that, because I want us to be scrutinized. I want people to have strong beliefs and interpretations of what we do and how we do it. So I invite the scrutiny. It's vital to what everyone in this business does. How to regain that credibility is literally one story at a time. And for those either not fascinated by the Mueller story or deadened by it, the last 2 years have not helped. Okay, the speculative infatuation with the story does not help credibility. It doesn't help for the people who thought it might be true, and it certainly doesn't help in the minds of people who didn't believe it ever. And they look at that and say, you're not being arbiters of what's happened, you're trying to push me in some sort of direction. So we need to self-regulate. We need to be more aware of these declining pre-Trump credibility issues, more honest with ourselves about what's happening, how we're losing touch with this audience. And it's a kind of introspection I don't find in my industry occurs all that often. And the effects of that have been there for all to see. And I'm not either discouraged or upset by lots of competition, lots of discordant voices. Because in one sense, we are now asking questions that are kind of fundamental. What's truth? How can it be found? And who can I rely upon to provide it on a daily basis? I'm fine with those questions, because I believe the work I do will meet and answer those questions every day. And so, in an odd way, for people who are serious journalists, who take this work deeply seriously, this is the perfect time. This is the time to answer the question, because we're, as a country, asking it. And political leaders are wagging condemning fingers at us. Fine. Condemn us, then read us. And we'll either measure up or we won't. But the testing is for us to live up to. And I have a phrase that I used to say at journalistic symposiums long before President Trump came along, long before candidate Trump came along. It never really landed with the weight it tends to land now. But it was true then, it's true now, it'll be true forever. Credible journalism will always outlast incredible politicians.
On that note, Major, thank you for a great evening. Thank you all. Yes, that's great. Go ahead, follow Barbara. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Hope to see you a week from Sunday for the Dole Lecture.